Welcome to my channel. When I first moved into the neighborhood, I thought I had found a slice of peace. The cul-de-sac was quiet, the houses were uniform, and the lawn stretched out like endless green carpets. Every driveway was lined with perfectly clipped shrubs, and every front yard carried the same expression: safe, predictable, and carefully maintained. It was a kind of place where conformity wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. I, however, had different plans. I had grown up in a home where gardens weren't just pieces of land. They were living sanctuaries. My grandmother used to say that flowers weren't meant to be arranged like soldiers, but allowed to bloom like music, each plant with its own rhythm, its own voice. That belief stayed with me, and when I finally bought this modest home at the edge of the cul-de-sac, I decided my front yard would be a reflection of that. Instead of laying down sterile sod and symmetrical hedges, I turned the soil into a canvas. Wildflowers sprouted in bursts of purple and yellow. Vines curled gracefully along a wooden trellis. Herbs grew in raised beds, and a bird bath stood in the center, where sparrows gathered at dawn. My garden became a living mosaic, one that drew butterflies, bees, and even the occasional hummingbird. To me, it was beautiful, messy, vibrant, unapologetic. But beauty, as I would soon learn, was a dangerous word in my neighborhood. At first, I noticed glances. Neighbors who walked their dogs would slow down when passing my home, their eyes flicking over the sprawling flowers with thinly veiled judgment. Cars driving to the cul-de-sac sometimes lingered, windows rolling down, as if the drivers couldn't help but stare at the anomaly breaking the neighborhood's mirror-perfect image. It was subtle, but I could feel it, the sense that my garden wasn't just unusual, it was unwelcome. The whispers came next. At a block party, I overheard two women talking just a little too loudly about how some people didn't seem to understand the importance of keeping things neat. Another time, while unloading groceries, I caught sight of a neighbor shaking his head as he muttered something about property values. The garden that brought me joy had become a silent battleground, though no one had dared confront me directly. Yet, that changed when Karen arrived. Karen was the kind of neighbor you couldn't miss even if you tried. She lived 2 doors down, in a house with white shutters so clean they practically sparkled, and a lawn so manicured it looked like it had been iron flat. She carried herself with the authority of someone who believed the entire neighborhood fell under her personal jurisdiction. Always armed with a clipboard at HOA meetings, always dressed in pastels that screamed superiority. Karen was a presence that demanded notice. It was late one afternoon when I first felt the full force of her disapproval. I was kneeling by my flower beds, gently tucking new seedlings into the soil, when I noticed her shadow fall across me. She stood at the edge of my property, arms folded, her lips pursed into a thin line. For several seconds she said nothing, just surveyed the sprawl of flowers and greenery with the expression of a judge passing silent condemnation. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of verdict. My garden, she said, was too ugly. Those words lodged themselves deep, not because I believed them, but because they revealed what I had suspected all along. My little sanctuary had become enemy number 1 in Karen's mission to maintain perfection. From that moment on, the tension escalated. I noticed her pointing toward my yard whenever she spoke to other neighbors, her gestures sharp, her expression grim. I caught her taking photos of my garden from the sidewalk, her phone angled just so, as though collecting evidence for a case only she was prosecuting. She would linger outside my property, inspecting the edges where wildflowers had stretched toward the sidewalk, shaking her head as if every blossom was a personal offense. I tried to ignore it at first. After all, a garden was a garden. It harmed no one, and it was my right to grow what I wished on my land. But Karen was not the kind of person who tolerated being ignored. The first letter came tucked under my doormat, typed in neat Times New Roman font with no name attached, though the tone carried Karen's unmistakable fingerprint. It declared that my yard violated the visual harmony of the neighborhood and urged me to consider the broader community before indulging personal tastes. A week later, another letter appeared, this one more insistent, warning that if I didn't make necessary corrections, further action would be taken. Still, I refused to bend. I watered my plants, tended my herbs, and let my flowers bloom as defiantly as I could. My garden was not just soil and seeds anymore. It had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that individuality had a place even in the most uniform of neighborhoods. But Karen wasn't finished. She thrived on escalation, and in her mind my refusal was a direct challenge. She began gathering allies, convincing neighbors that my garden was more than just unsightly. It was a threat. She told them it would lower property values, attract pests, and ruin the aesthetic harmony they had all worked so hard to preserve. Some nodded in agreement, others hesitated. But her campaign had begun. The day I saw her standing at the end of the cul-de-sac with a clipboard, collecting signatures for a petition, I realized this wasn't just about flowers anymore. It was about power. Karen wanted control, and my garden was her battlefield. And though I didn't know it yet, she was about to regret ever stepping onto it. The weeks that followed Karen's first confrontation were a lesson in persistence. Where most neighbors would have let the matter drop after a polite refusal, Karen only grew more determined. What had begun as whispered comments and anonymous letters evolved into a full-fledged campaign, one fueled by her belief that she alone was the guardian of the cul-de-sac's order. It began with a petition. Karen moved from door to door, clipboard in hand, her expression firm and purposeful. She caught people in their driveways, stopped them during evening walks, and even rang doorbells uninvited, pressing her case with a practiced speech. To her, it was a civic duty, a moral responsibility to protect the beauty and value of the neighborhood. Some neighbors signed out of politeness, unwilling to provoke her sharp tongue. Others signed out of fear, knowing that saying no to Karen often carried its own social consequences. A handful genuinely believed her words, convinced that my garden was an eyesore that would drive down their property values. But not everyone was so easily persuaded. A quiet resistance began to emerge among those who admired the garden in secret, the ones who had never said a word but had occasionally lingered on the sidewalk to watch butterflies dance among the flowers. Still, Karen carried her clipboard like a sword, and every signature was another cut she believed would bring me down. I watched the process unfold from a distance, each encounter playing out like a scene in a drama I hadn't asked to star in. Some days, I caught glimpses of her triumphant expression as another name was scribbled onto her list. Other days, I saw her jaw tighten when someone closed the door politely in her face. The tension grew heavier with each passing week, until it seemed the air in the cul-de-sac buzzed with anticipation of a confrontation. And confrontation came. One Saturday morning, I stepped outside to tend to my garden as usual. The air was warm, the sun bright, and the flowers stretched eagerly toward the light. Yet the peacefulness shattered when I spotted Karen approaching, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. She walked with brisk determination, her pastel cardigan swaying with each step, her eyes fixed on me like a hawk circling its prey. She stopped at the edge of my yard, holding out the clipboard as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. The pages were filled with signatures, names scrawled in hurried ink, neighbors who had allowed themselves to be recruited into her cause. Though she said nothing at first, the message was clear. She believed she had the majority on her side. What she didn't realize, however, was that numbers on paper didn't equal authority. The HOA had rules, but they weren't as simple as Karen liked to believe. My garden didn't break any specific bylaws. There were no regulations banning wildflowers, no rules dictating that every yard had to be a sea of grass. Karen's case was one of preference, not law, and preference was not enough to strip me of my rights. Yet that truth didn't stop her. In her mind, the petition was a weapon, a declaration that she spoke for the community. She carried herself with the certainty of someone convinced she was untouchable, and it was that certainty that would eventually become her undoing. The petition marked a turning point. With it, Karen moved beyond whispered gossip and passive-aggressive notes. She stepped into open hostility. She presented the signatures at the next HOA meeting, her voice dripping with self-righteousness as she accused me of ruining the neighborhood's appearance. She painted vivid pictures of declining home values, infestations of pests, and visitors recoiling in horror at the sight of my unkempt jungle. But what Karen didn't expect was resistance. A few neighbors, emboldened by her aggression, finally spoke up. One elderly woman mentioned how much joy the flowers brought her grandchildren when they came to visit. Another quietly admitted that she often walked her dog past my house just to admire the colors. Someone else pointed out that not everyone wanted to live in a neighborhood where every lawn looked the same, flat and sterile. The room, once under Karen's spell, shifted uneasily as her narrative began to crack. Still, the HOA board, cautious and uncomfortable, avoided taking a firm stance. They didn't want to confront Karen directly, but neither did they want to commit to punishing me for something that wasn't clearly against the rules. Instead, They left a matter unresolved, a simmering conflict with no resolution in sight. That uncertainty only fueled Karen's obsession. If the board wouldn't act, she would. Her tactics grew more aggressive. She began photographing not just my yard, but me working in it, her phone clicking like the shutter of a paparazzi camera. She spread rumors that I was attracting rodents, though no one had ever seen a single one. She cornered neighbors in grocery store aisles, at the park, even at church, spinning her story with increasing desperation. I felt the weight of it pressing down on me, yet with every act of aggression, my resolve only hardened. My garden had never felt more alive, more necessary. Each flower that bloomed became a silent protest. Each bee that landed a reminder that life thrived in diversity, not conformity. And though I sometimes felt isolated in my fight, small moments reminded me I wasn't alone. Children wandered to the edge of my yard, pointing at butterflies with wide eyes. A young couple, new to the neighborhood, left a kind note in my mailbox saying how much they admired the colors of my garden. Even some of the neighbors who had signed Karen's petition gave me apologetic glances, as if silently admitting they had only signed to avoid her wrath. Karen mistook these quiet gestures of support as weakness, believing the silence of others meant victory. But what she failed to see was that silence often hides strength, and gardens, much like people, have a way of growing stronger under pressure. By the time summer reached its peak, the cul-de-sac was no longer the serene, uniform place it had once been. It was a neighborhood divided, split between those who followed Karen's crusade and those who quietly admired my defiance. And though Karen believed she held the upper hand with her clipboard and her signatures, the truth was far more complicated. The more she pushed, the more cracks appeared in her carefully constructed image of control. And soon, those cracks would begin to widen. Because Karen wasn't just fighting a garden anymore. She was fighting the idea that she could control everyone around her. And that was a battle she couldn't win. Karen had always been relentless, but after the petition failed to bring the results she wanted, something inside her seemed to harden. The polite mask she had once worn slipped away, replaced by open hostility that left little doubt about her intentions. My garden had become more than just a nuisance in her eyes. It was a personal affront, a challenge to her authority. And she wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. The escalation began subtly, as most things did in the cul-de-sac. Small acts, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but sharp enough to send a message. One morning, I found my recycling bin tipped over, its contents scattered across my driveway. Another day, I noticed the bird bath in my garden had been shifted slightly, as though someone had nudged it just enough to disturb its balance. At first, I told myself these were accidents, coincidences. But coincidences piled up quickly in Karen's shadow. Her presence became impossible to ignore. She lingered on the sidewalk more often, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a neighbor she was trying to recruit into her crusade. She would stand there, arms crossed, staring at my garden as though willing it to shrivel under her glare. When I caught her watching, she didn't look away. Instead, she met my eyes with a thin, triumphant smile, as if daring me to react. What unsettled me most, however, wasn't her presence but her persistence. She had moved beyond casual complaints and small acts of sabotage. She was building a case. I noticed her snapping photos at all hours. At dawn when the dew still clung to petals, at dusk when the shadows stretched across the yard. She wrote notes on her clipboard, scribbling furiously whenever she caught sight of me pruning or watering. Every detail, no matter how insignificant, was being cataloged for some unknown purpose. Then came the letters from the HOA. The first was polite, almost apologetic, citing concerns raised by members of the community, and asking me to consider aligning the appearance of my property with neighborhood standards. It wasn't a demand, but a suggestion, the kind of bureaucratic wording that left plenty of room for interpretation. I knew whose hand was behind it, even if her name wasn't on the page. I ignored it. The second letter was less subtle. It listed vague violations, disorderly plant growth, lack of aesthetic uniformity, potential hazards, none of which were clearly defined in the bylaws. This time, the wording hinted at consequences if I failed to comply. I could feel Karen's fingerprints all over it. Still, I held my ground. The HOA, however, wasn't eager to take sides. They were caught in the middle, pressured by Karen's relentless campaigning, but wary of overstepping their authority. Each letter they sent seemed less like a command and more like a plea for the problem to resolve itself. But Karen wasn't interested in resolution. She wanted submission. When the letters failed, she turned to theatrics. One afternoon, I returned home to find a group of neighbors gathered at the edge of my yard. At the center was Karen, gesturing dramatically toward my flowers as she spoke. She painted the scene with words thick with exaggeration, describing my garden as a breeding ground for snakes and rodents, a jungle overtaking the block. Her audience nodded uneasily, some out of agreement, others out of fear of being singled out. I stood silently on my porch, watching the performance unfold. She knew I was there, but she didn't stop. If anything, she spoke louder, her voice rising with righteous indignation, her finger jabbing toward the bird bath, the vines, the wildflowers. To her, this was theater, and the cul-de-sac was her stage. But what Karen failed to notice was that not everyone was convinced. I saw it in the way some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between her and me. I caught the hesitant glances, the whispers exchanged when her back was turned. For every person she rallied to her cause, another quietly questioned her obsession. The divide in the neighborhood grew deeper. Some avoided me altogether, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire. Others offered quiet support, small nod when they passed, brief smiles, a word of encouragement slipped under their breath. The cul-de-sac, once united in its uniformity, had become a community of factions, and Karen stood at the center of the storm she created. But storms have a way of spiraling out of control. It was late one evening when I discovered just how far Karen was willing to go. I was sitting by the window, the soft glow of a lamp casting light across the room, when movement outside caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a wind rustling to the flowers, but then I saw the shadow, tall, deliberate, moving along the edge of my yard. My chest tightened as I leaned closer. There she was. Karen stood at the edge of my garden, phone in hand, its flashlight beam sweeping across the flowers. She was photographing my yard in the dead of night, crouching down to capture close-ups, adjusting angles, documenting every detail as though preparing evidence for a trial. I didn't step outside. I didn't confront her. Instead, I watched from behind the glass, the weight of her obsession pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about control, about proving she could bend the neighborhood to her will. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't going to stop. Not until she believed she had won. But what Karen didn't know was that I had been preparing in my own quiet way. I had kept every letter, photographed every incident, noted every late-night intrusion. While she thought she was building a case against me, I was quietly building one against her. And sooner or later, the balance of power would shift. The garden that had once been my sanctuary had become a battlefield. And though the war was far from over, one truth had become clear. Karen had underestimated me. By the time midsummer arrived, the cul-de-sac was no longer just a quiet collection of homes. It had become a stage for a conflict that refused to fade. Karen had drawn her battle lines, rallying her allies with petitions, rumors, and midnight prowls through my yard. Yet, while she grew louder and more aggressive, I grew quieter, more deliberate. I had learned something important. Battles are not always won by shouting the loudest. Sometimes, they are won by waiting, by watching, and by letting the other side dig their own hole. I began documenting everything. Every letter that arrived from the HOA, I photographed and filed away. Every time Karen stood on the sidewalk with her phone, I captured images of her in return, time-stamped and dated. When she left notes on my door, I stored them in a binder. Even the late-night trespass, I recorded with a discreet security camera I had installed near the front window. Its lens caught her creeping across the edge of my garden. Phone flashlight sweeping, her face illuminated with a kind of intensity that could not be mistaken for anything but obsession. At first, it felt strange, turning my home into a quiet archive of evidence. But the more I collected, the more empowered I felt. Karen thought she was preparing her case against me, but unknowingly, she was building mine against her. Every move she made was another thread in the web she was weaving around herself. Meanwhile, the cracks in her campaign grew wider. Her constant complaints at HOA meetings, once tolerated with nods of agreement, began to wear thin. Neighbors who had once backed her petition started avoiding her in public, weary of hearing the same tirades over and over again. The board itself, desperate to appear neutral, became increasingly uncomfortable with her accusations. Each time she demanded action against me, they shuffled their papers, muttered about bylaws, and tried to move the conversation to safer ground. Still, Karen pushed harder. One afternoon, I returned from running errands to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was another so-called warning from the HOA, citing vague violations about unsightly property maintenance. But this time, I didn't just file away. I took it straight to the HOA office, binder in hand, and demanded clarification. The board members, caught off guard, stammered as I laid out the inconsistencies, the lack of bylaw references, the suspiciously identical wording that matched Karen's earlier letters. Their discomfort told me everything I needed to know. Karen was feeding them drafts, and they were too intimidated to refuse. It was then that I realized Karen's power didn't come from authority. It came from fear. The neighbors feared her judgment. The board feared her persistence. And even those who disliked her preferred silence over confrontation. But fear only lasts until it's exposed. I decided it was time to push back, not with confrontation, but with exposure. The first step was subtle. I began inviting a few neighbors into my garden. Nothing formal, just small gestures, a bowl of fresh herbs left at the doorstep, a bouquet of wildflowers offered in passing. Some evenings, I set out a couple of chairs near the bird bath and invited those who seemed curious to sit with me, to enjoy the colors, the scents, the sounds of bees buzzing lazily in the warm air. It wasn't long before word spread, and people who had once avoided my yard began stopping by voluntarily. Children tugged their parents toward the garden after dinner walks. Couples wandered over, curious to see what Karen had labeled an eyesore. What they found wasn't chaos but charm, an oasis of color and life in a neighborhood otherwise painted in uniform shades of green. Slowly, perceptions began to shift. Karen's warnings about pests and plummeting property values looked increasingly ridiculous against the sight of butterflies landing gently on petals and neighbors sipping tea in my yard. But Karen wasn't blind. She noticed a change, and it only deepened her desperation. Her complaints grew shriller. She accused me of manipulating the neighborhood, of bribing people with flowers and herbs. She stormed into HOA meetings with new evidence. Photographs of vines trailing slightly past the fence line, or leaves scattered on the sidewalk after a windy day. Each time, her claims grew weaker, more unhinged, and each time, the board's patience thinned. The final spark came one evening when Karen made a mistake she couldn't undo. I had been reviewing my security footage, as I often did, when I caught something shocking. The camera showed Karen walking up to my yard under cover darkness, clutching a small bottle in her hand. She crouched near the flower beds, tilting the bottle downward, shaking something into the soil. Her movements were hurried, frantic, as though she knew she was crossing a line but couldn't stop herself. Then, just as quickly as she had arrived, she scurried back into the night. I knew instantly what she had done. She wasn't just photographing anymore. She was trying to sabotage my garden. The next morning, the damage appeared. A patch of flowers near the walkway began to wither, their leaves curling unnaturally, their stems bending as though poisoned. My heart sank at the sight, but anger quickly replaced sorrow. Karen had finally gone too far. She had moved from harassment into destruction. I didn't confront her directly. I didn't call her out in the street or leave angry notes on her door. Instead, I gathered the footage, printed still frames, and compiled them neatly into my growing binder of evidence. I made copies, labeled each page, and quietly prepared for what came next. The garden had once been the battlefield, but now the war had shifted arenas. Karen thought she could poison my flowers and bully the neighborhood into silence. What she didn't realize was that she had handed me the weapon I needed to end this conflict once and for all. Because evidence doesn't wither like flowers. Evidence lasts. And soon, Karen was about to face it. By the time autumn rolled in, the cul-de-sac no longer felt like the same place I had moved into. The air was heavy with tension, and every glance across the street seemed to carry unspoken questions. Karen had waged her war with petitions, rumors, and sabotage, while I had quietly built my case. Now, the scales were ready to tip. It was the HOA meeting that set the stage for everything. These gatherings, once sleepy affairs where neighbors discussed fence repairs or community barbecues, had turned into battlegrounds because of Karen. She had spent months demanding action, and the board, exhausted and cornered, finally scheduled a session devoted specifically to community concerns regarding property upkeep. Everyone knew what that meant. It was a trial of my garden. The room was small, fluorescent lights humming above as folding chairs filled with curious neighbors. At the front sat the HOA board, papers stacked neatly before them, faces tight with nerves. And at the center of it all sat Karen, clipboard in hand, posture rigid, her expression radiating confidence. She had orchestrated this moment for months, convinced she would finally win. The meeting opened with the usual pleasantries, but it wasn't long before Karen seized the floor. She launched into her speech with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it countless times. She spoke of property values, of uniformity, of community standards. She waved her clipboard as if it were scripture, rattling off the names of those who had signed her petition, brandishing photographs of my garden as though they were evidence of a crime. Her voice grew louder with each accusation, her gestures sharper. She painted my garden as a danger, a disgrace, a blot on the perfect canvas of the neighborhood. And as she spoke, she looked around the room with the certainty of someone expecting applause. But the applause never came. Instead, silence filled the room. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, their eyes darting between Karen and me. The board members looked weary, their pens tapping nervously against their notepads. The performance that once might have carried weight now felt heavy-handed, desperate. When Karen finally finished, her words hanging in the air like smoke, the board turned to me. For the first time, I stood to speak. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't match her theatrics. Instead, I opened the binder I had carried with me, thick with pages of carefully organized evidence. One by one, I laid them out, copies of every anonymous letter, photographs of Karen lingering outside my property at night, documentation of every vague and baseless warning the HOA had sent me, and finally, the still images from the security footage. Karen crouched in the dark, bottle in hand, pouring poison into the soil of my garden. Gasps rippled through the room. The board members leaned forward, their pens frozen in midair. Even the neighbors who had once nodded along with Karen's complaint stared in disbelief, their eyes wide as the images spoke louder than any words ever could. I explained calmly, methodically, that my garden did not violate a single bylaw, that the HOA's own rules allowed for personal landscaping choices, so long as they did not present hazards, and that wildflowers, vines, and bird baths were not hazards. That every accusation Karen had hurled was either exaggerated or entirely fabricated. And then, I let the photographs of her sabotage speak for themselves. For the first time, Karen's mask slipped. Her confidence faltered as the board questioned her, their voices sharp with frustration. She tried to protest, to spin stories about how the footage was misleading, how she was only inspecting the garden, but the evidence was undeniable. Her words stumbled. Her hands shook, and the certainty she had carried for months evaporated under the weight of the truth. The neighbors, too, began to shift. Those who had once supported her grew quiet, unwilling to be associated with her actions. Some who had stayed silent before now spoke up, voicing their appreciation for the garden, their admiration for its beauty and its life. The narrative Karen had built so carefully crumbled in real time, piece by piece, until she stood alone. The board made their decision that night. Not only would no action be taken against my garden, but they also issued a formal warning to Karen for harassment and misconduct. The president, her tone firm, made it clear that the HOA was not a weapon for personal vendettas. If Karen continued her campaign, further consequences would follow. Karen sat frozen, her face pale, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest like a shield that no longer protected her. For once, she had no words. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors approached me, not all, but enough to matter. Some apologized for signing the petition. Others offered kind words about the garden, admitting they had always admired it, but hadn't dared to say so before. A few even asked for advice on how to bring more color and life into their own yards. Karen left quickly, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, her shoulders stiff. For someone who had once commanded the cul-de-sac with an iron grip, her retreat was the clearest sign of all. She had lost. But though the battle had been won, the story wasn't over yet, because in neighborhoods like ours, grudges have long shadows. And while Karen had been defeated in public, the question remained, how would she live with her downfall in private? The night of the HOA meeting marked a turning point, but the story didn't end there. In neighborhoods like ours, reputations linger. They cling to the air like the scent of cut grass or fresh paint, impossible to shake, remembered long after the moment has passed. And for Karen, the reputation she had built so carefully over the years collapsed almost overnight. In the days following the meeting, the cul-de-sac seemed quieter, though the silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was a hush that follows a storm, heavy with the awareness that things had changed. Neighbors who once gathered comfortably on driveways now spoke in smaller, hushed groups, their glances shifting toward Karen's house before lowering again. Her pastel shutters and manicured lawn still gleamed, but the energy surrounding her home had curdled. Karen herself became a shadow of her former presence. Where once she patrolled the street with clipboard in hand, now her appearances were fleeting. She no longer lingered outside my yard, no longer snapped photos or delivered pointed glares. Instead, her curtains twitched during the day, her silhouette visible only for a moment before retreating. She had become a watcher in her own kingdom, reduced to observing the world she had once controlled. But for me, the change was liberating. For the first time since moving in, I could tend my garden without the weight of her eyes on me. I planted new rows of wildflowers, repaired the patch of soil she had poisoned, and restored the bird bath to its rightful place. The garden thrived, bursting with late-season blooms, as though celebrating its survival. Neighbors stopped by more often now, no longer afraid to be seen near my yard. Some asked for clippings, others for tips on growing herbs or attracting butterflies. Children laughed as they chased each other along the sidewalk, pausing to marvel at the bees buzzing lazily among the blossoms. The transformation was subtle but profound. The cul-de-sac, once uniform and rigid, began to soften. A few homes added flower beds. Others set out small bird feeders or potted plants. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to suggest that maybe conformity wasn't the only way to live here. Maybe individuality had a place after all. Karen, of course, noticed. I could feel her eyes behind the curtains when neighbors carried home bags of soil or flower pots. Each small act of change was a reminder of what she had lost, the influence she once held, the obedience she once demanded. And though she never spoke of it, the silence from her corner of the street was its own kind of confession. The HOA, too, had shifted. After the embarrassment of Karen's exposure, the board became more cautious, more deliberate. No longer were vague letters sent without evidence. No longer were complaints entertained without scrutiny. They had learned the cost of letting one person's obsession dictate the rules for everyone else. The binder of evidence I presented remained in their records, a quiet reminder of what happens when authority is misused. Still, not everything was neatly resolved. Karen remained a presence, even in her retreat. At block parties, she hovered at the edges, her smile tight, her conversations brief. She still maintained her lawn with the precision of a soldier tending barracks, each blade of grass aligned, each hedge perfectly squared. But the authority she once carried in her posture was gone. She was no longer the voice of the neighborhood. She was its cautionary tale. For me, the victory was bittersweet. I had defended my garden, preserved my right to create something beautiful in my own way, and in doing so, I had helped the neighborhood glimpse a different kind of life. Yet I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness when I thought of Karen. She had built her world on control, on the belief that order meant power, and when that illusion shattered, she was left with nothing but silence. In the months that followed, the seasons changed. Autumn painted the cul-de-sac in warm hues, leaves crunching underfoot as the air grew crisp. Winter came with its stillness, my garden resting beneath a blanket of frost, waiting patiently for spring. And when spring finally arrived, it brought with it an explosion of color. Flowers burst forth, bees returned, and the garden thrived more vibrantly than ever before. Neighbors stopped often now, no longer shy about their admiration. Some even joked that Karen's crusade had backfired, drawing more attention to the garden than I could have ever hoped for. What had once been a source of controversy had become a source of pride, a symbol of resilience, and a quiet reminder that beauty often comes from daring to be different. Karen never apologized, not directly, but perhaps she didn't need to. Her absence from the sidewalk, her silence at meetings, her retreat behind twitching curtains, all of it spoke louder than words. She had lost a battle she thought was hers to win, and in doing so, she had learned that power built on fear cannot last. The story of the garden became part of the neighborhood's history, retold in hushed tones at barbecues and block parties. New families moving heard about the great garden feud before they even unpacked their boxes. Some laughed, some shook their heads, but all understood the lesson. Conformity was not the only path, and those who tried to enforce it too harshly risked losing everything. As for me, I continued tending my sanctuary. Each day I knelt in the soil, dirt on my hands, sun on my back, I was reminded of why it started in the first place. The garden was more than flowers and herbs. It was resilience made visible, defiance rooted deep in the earth, and beauty that refused to be silenced. Karen had once called it too ugly, but in the end, the only ugliness exposed was her obsession, and she regretted it, quietly, completely, and irreversibly. Please like and subscribe to my channel.